celebrating our 20th season. From the college by the lake, meeting the personalities and discussing the issues that affect all of Coeur d'Alene and the inland Northwest. We are the North Idaho College Public Forum. And now, here's your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
Today we discuss with you a very serious and important topic that many of you discuss in your homes, I'm sure, and has received a lot of attention in the United States in recent years. We'd like to talk about a national and international problem entitled the homeless. In our large cities in the United States, the number of people who are without shelter is increasing each year, and there's much discussion on what to do about that. We're so fortunate to bring to our program today a very close friend of mine that I've known for years, and in fact her whole family, and we're so pleased that she's been appointed to a very important position. She is now a member of the board of directors of what is known as the National Coalition for the Homeless, Incorporated. I welcome to the program Barbara Miller.
Thanks, Terry.
In addition to her serving on that board throughout the United States, she is also a member of the Idaho Citizens Network and does a lot of work on other issues that deal with consumers' problems and also the people of our state and the issues that affect their life so much, such as in the field of health care. And Barbara, I commend you for being so committed to the people of our state and our country.
Thank you.
And as always, I'm very pleased to have Janelle Burke, who is an attorney in the state of Idaho and is a regular member of our panel. And I shall ask Janelle to commence the questioning.
Barbara, it's a pleasure to have you here and to discuss this subject with you. It's one that I know a lot of us have been interested in and have read about. Can you tell us, because you're in a position to know these things, how prevalent is this problem? What exactly is the magnitude of the problem of the homeless in the United States?
Well, the magnitude is far more extensive nationwide than it is, in Idaho. Idaho, with its population, has somehow, avoided the homeless issue, unlike larger metropolitan cities. But nevertheless, it is, it is here and it is prevalent. It seems like in the work, the assessment that we're getting on the issue is it's been avoided because, well, it began back, several administrations ago when the Reagan administration gave the mentally handicapped more freedom through some federal legislation, but it did not provide facilities for those people to go to, people to help make them the transition into a normal, regular, routine way of life, and that's when you found those kinds of people sleeping in subways, sleeping in the White House, flower gardens, bus stops, and from then on, in the last 10, 12 years, due to unemployment, healthcare costs, those kinds of things, that is how the issue has become full-fledged, and it is here in Idaho. We know that from the CHAS study, the Comprehensive Housing Affordability Study, which is really an assessment that the federal government does to try to, figure out the problem state by state. And there is a little bit of problem in that study because accurate figures are, really slow to come. But nevertheless, some of the real intense groups and organizations that have been, and people who have been working on the issue, Stuart B. McKinney being one of them, declares that homelessness is anyone who does not have a regular home to go to at the end of the day. So just in one example, in the CHAS that they've done, students in Shoshone County, there are 14, that's a small number, but just for one county, who have declared they do not have a home. And that's just one area of the homelessness.
And that's students, you're saying.
That's right.
That's young people who
That's
don't
right.
have a place to go at night. And I suppose that you would say that there are two different kinds of homeless people who are totally homeless, as distinguished from people who do not have adequate housing. But if we're talking now about the homeless, there are those people who perhaps are camping in the woods, and then there are those people who might be going from place to place. They're at one house one night, another house another night. Let's explore that area a little bit. What is the more typical kind of homeless individual in, say, North Idaho, and I'm sure that's probably true in rural areas in the state of Washington, Canada, Montana, other places that our viewers might live?
In our particular area, that the families who are, camping in campgrounds and students are a real targeted population, a population in need, as well as the mentally handicapped. And I hopefully would like to mention just briefly some of the work that was conducted at our first board meeting dealt with legislation to establish safe havens for the mentally handicapped. Those kinds of people, they've always been here, and we've just kind of taken that situation, as no big deal, but they've been here for a long time. We're finding in our region families who, to digress a little bit, Habitat for Humanity has done a study, and Habitat for Humanity finds ways of dealing very in isolated ways of building single home, houses for communities. They have facts that says it's 4 months that the average citizen, the average working person, man, woman, family has between losing their job or having a healthcare crisis when they're looking at being homeless themselves. So people are vulnerable everywhere, and in North Idaho, Eastern Washington, Montana, those areas, we're finding people who lose their job, who do not have health care benefits, and they have no way of affording a house. So what they do is, in the summer, you will find them going to the campgrounds, and they can save money by spending 3 or 4 months in the campgrounds. They don't pay the cost to maintain a home, and what that allows them to do then, it may not, find them a job. If they've already got a job, that's okay, but what it does is allows them to save up, because with Coeur d'Alene becoming a resort area and the tourism emphasis, landlords and people are asking something they never used to before, first and last month's rent and a cleaning deposit, and you're looking at $1,000 right there, and that's really, really hard. And then the students are a real particular problem, because they lots of times can't get along at home. They're abandoned by choice, or because parents, there's just that problem at home and nothing intact to deal with them. Shoshone County has a real need to establish a shelter home. Kootenai County is very fortunate, and so is Spokane, to already have some of those types of shelters and homes intact. But that is a real vulnerable population. And from there, if you're a student, it seems like you never recover. You just end up really being homeless for a long period of time. And
Barbara, you really said something that's very startling and very correct. Many families that work very hard, and they have children, and they just have no way of accumulating a lot of reserved funds that takes the money for the payments on the home and food and transportation, all those things. And so with unemployment, when it goes up and we go through these cycles in particular, there's just not that reserve there. And so there's so many people who right now think they will never be homeless that could very easily in a very short period of time. You've made that point very clearly. Would you tell us a little bit about the National Coalition for Homeless that you're on the board? I know a lot of this information you're talking about that you're discussing within that, but I'd like to know a little bit about its structure and purpose as an organization. Then later we'll get into some of the things it recommends to do.
It was really an exciting opportunity. The issue wasn't that great, but the opportunity to meet with the board has representatives from each state in the nation. Some have more than Idaho right now, but some are allowed to have a couple of representatives. and to discuss at this first meeting in March in Washington, D.C. They had 80 representatives who were working on all different levels of homelessness, from the veterans have their own particular needs that are now coming, into light. And the board was convened in 1983, and its purpose at that time was simple, and they still go back to that, although it is becoming a little bit more sophisticated in addressing the needs. But their purpose was to empower homeless people. A lot of times those people are very vital to resolving the issue, but because of their own needs, powerless. And the second purpose was to establish litigation, ways to address the issue, whether it be through public education awareness, national legislation, local legislation. And the third was to challenge those existing opportunities to provide and remedy the needs for homeless. So from that, it got real extensive. There was an opportunity for each state to address what is going on in their state, the problems. Idaho, if I could interject at this time, is really working on some areas to raise the public education. And this year in the legislature, a trust fund bill was introduced. And the purpose of that was to create a fund. Realtors and the real estate commission was getting behind using some escrow money to go into a fund, and then the state would put up matching funds. I think there was something like $200,000 asked for, and I just found out the legislation went through, but like Idaho, you have to pass the legislation, and the next year you work for the money. The next year you employ it. So it did get passed, and we're excited about that. There are two new organizations in the state that are springing up. One right here in Kootenai County, North Idaho Community Service Corporation, and then the Idaho Housing Coalition that they were real instrumental in getting this trust fund legislation passed. So that was neat to go and talk to those people and see how they really do care. And there's a lot of significant work being done through the national board.
With that kind of national organization and then state organizations, not only in the national coalition that you have, but these others that you've identified, that will create more public awareness and also gets the attention of public policymakers that would not happen without that. But I have a question along that line. I was reading recently from a national journal that because the homeless problem has been with us so long and has grown worse, particularly in our major urban centers, that one of the thrust of this article indicated that since the people who are coming and going in the city each day have gotten so used to seeing the homeless, that there actually was probably less concern and support than there were, say, just a few years ago. That one of the dangers of such a problem is that people get somewhat callous at times after seeing it. Do you find that to be the case, or is it more difficult to arouse the public's concern about this issue?
It's always, it's not difficult for someone to arouse it. It's difficult for the population to relate to it. It raises a level of consciousness where you sit down and you talk to someone about the issue, and they go from varying degrees of being very uncomfortable to just saying in somewhat of an apathetic way, yeah, I know it's a concern and I'll do something about that sometime. Those people are, very instrumental can be very instrumental in resolving the issue. There's always that feeling that somebody else is going to do it, but there's not. There's a clear accountability on the federal level through some of the bureaucracies, through HUD, some of those agencies that are supposed to be dealing with the issue, and actually from supposing to to doing it are miles in between. In the meantime, the issue is growing with, the unemployment situation. I don't know if that answered
Yes.
your question, but it's got to, all of those sources. One of the things that was discussed at the board meeting was how the past procedures and emphasis, they are not working. So we're going to have to become more intense about what we're doing and addressing them and covering more areas. Like something else that came out of the board was an initiation to do a voter registration day. 2 days during the year there will be a National Voter Registration Day, and concentrated efforts will be to register homeless people, because if you get them organized, then they can start speaking up and supporting issues, remedies, and also appointing or identifying leaders, legislators who are going to work and support those bills to resolve the issue.
That's been one of the real difficult problems, even taking the census, is finding where the homeless
That's
are.
right.
And although this year, in 1990 was the most concerted effort to do so. And then again, finding people to register. And if you're not part of the political process, the chances of being heard is so much less.
There's also the tendency to think of this country as being very rich and taking care of its people, and putting emphasis of funding in the wrong areas. Another concern that came up was rebudgeting or redirecting the national defense budget. That's an area that the board the coalition is beginning to address more closely in D.C., that to find funding is to take it from that budget and put it into the homeless budget. And they've been successful, in one small area, and that was real exciting to see that, restructuring happening there.
Janelle Burke.
I would like to talk a little bit about the homeless and the distinction between them and those who have inadequate housing. I would assume that there are large numbers of people who are living in substandard housing, particularly in metropolitan areas, but also in rural areas as well. Do you deal with those people, and do you have some facts to talk about with respect to them?
Rural areas definitely have their problems, because to draw the resources, the money, the finances from the federal to the state is reasonably successful, but many times it gets concentrated in the bigger cities. And Idaho, as you know, is between a 70 and 80% rural area, and it's true. The housing in those areas is inadequate, and what you find with those people is that they're very, very high risk. They're just sitting there day to day, inadequate heating, no jobs with mining and lumber, the timber going down.
How do you define inadequate housing?
I know how we identify it in Shoshone County is that
Okay.
the available housing there is built in the 1930s. So you're looking at an average home of somewhere around 60 years. It has, at the very least, inadequate insulation. It is in needs repair. It's in disarray. It has gaps in the windows. The foundations are falling down.
What about the health hazards? Are you talking now about running water too? I suspect in some areas there may not even be running water or indoor plumbing.
What you find is even in the small rural towns, excuse me, people are going further into the hills, into the rural areas, and building basic structures that don't have water, plumbing, lots of times electricity. So, there again, if they're able to solve those problems, then chances are they can survive because they don't have to pay for housing. But lots of times it isn't, and then they open themselves up for, health problems that then become a burden on all of the community. The indigency funds everywhere is every agency that's in a position to help has been overextended in the rural areas. So yeah, you do find those people at very, very high risk where they have a roof over their head, so to speak, today, but tomorrow they're very vulnerable, and then that becomes a problem for all of us that isn't being faced.
Barbara, one of the shows that I remember that we've done in the past, and it continues to be vivid in my memory, was a lady from the Spokane Valley who chose to take 6 weeks, and I believe it was, and go to Washington, D.C. and be a bag lady. She wanted to learn of the problems, and what a courageous thing to do, and what a caring thing to do, and it appears to have changed her life. And because she, on this program, described some of the conditions she saw on the streets in Washington, D.C. Would you, and it's been some time ago that we did that program, would you take some time to explain to our viewers some of the cases that your national board knows about? What happens to individuals, particularly when there's a really large population like a city? What happens to women in particular and children that find themselves on the street? I know that some of them go into shelters at night and must come back out of a day. How is that connected to crime and disease and so forth? Can you give us some rather vivid descriptions of the problem?
The best example would be to use the woman who was exactly that. She was a woman, a single mother, and she is now, is quite an exciting turn of events of what can happen, a success story, and an organizer for the coalition. And she talks about the problem never happening to her, that there are safety nets out there. There's, health and welfare in the largest cities. Is a tendency to be more. Her husband left. He lost his job. He couldn't face the situation that he had to deal with every day, taking care of her and I believe it was 2 or 3 children. And so he just left one day, and there she was. So she set out to all the agencies, and if she could get through the paperwork that she was confronted with, it held for a while. There are no jobs. She just went from bad to worse. Housing, there was no housing, and she ended up, living in the street. There's waiting lines for shelters, and just continued until she actually, ended up in the park, and made that her home, and became, immune to a lot of the things that were going on in her daily life. I'm not exactly sure what happened to the children, but to hear her tell the story, until then some of the coalition people found her, because that's some of the work. They extend out into those areas and just begin talking when they can. There's always that feeling of turning out people. The mental health people and the mental health regional board say homelessness in itself is a mental handicap. Just to cope with that, extends the problem until these people started talking to her, and it takes a long time for those people to come back. That if you can stop the issue before it becomes full-fledged,
But when there's people so desperate, and oftentimes if they have accumulated a little bit or someone's come by and given them some money or some food, there's danger of other people coming by and taking that, or even doing physical harm.
Sure. The actual crime rate. I mean, these people open themselves to all kinds of, alcoholism. Just getting by on the street is very, very dangerous. I can't remember what the actual murder rate is, but that population, in that segment of the population, it is very, very high.
Janelle Burke.
Well, sometimes we think about the institutionalization of people as being undesirable. And several years ago, many people used to be institutionalized who are now living within society, perhaps in some kind of group home. But there are also a large number of people who used to be institutionalized or would have been institutionalized a few years ago who are probably living on the streets. These are some of the people that you're talking about. What does the coalition recommend? How does the coalition feel that these people should be treated?
One of the things that we talked about there was the need to get funding and the targeted segment of homeless people were the mentally handicapped, the ones who had become disinstitutionalized. The problem you have there is in so many centers that funding is available, those people, you know, their problem is unique because they have things done to them by agency people, by people who are trying to help without telling them why it's being done, explaining to them, you know, and talking to them and making them understand that they're a vital segment of society and treating them like people. So there's that tendency to give them conditional help, meaning you come in to this shelter and you are required, you know, to be in bed by 8 o'clock. You have to take this medication. You have all of these restrictions, which isn't that much change from where they were. And they know the difference, and they don't like that. They have their own freedoms and their own rights. And one of the successes of the coalition was to get funding for what they call safe havens. And this was just a beginning of a shelter process that would offer 24-hour care, and it would suggest but not require that those people who have substance abuse problems, you know, seek remediation, seek, you know, help. They could just go there because they wanted to. That brought some confrontation on people who are more closely associated with this issue than I am, who said that that's a requirement that shouldn't be there. The people, the housing, if it's there for that reason, those people should be able to go in there and come and go, you know, pretty much as they please, but never, you know, ignore the opportunity to talk to them, you know, to get them help, get them back into, you know, a stable society, find them jobs if they want that.
So sorry to have to interrupt. We're out of time. Barbara Miller, thank you so much for coming. We commend you again on your work, and it is so important to so many people in our society.
Well, thank you for having me.
Ladies and gentlemen, our guest has been Barbara Miller of the National Coalition for Homeless Incorporated Board of Directors. I know you found this very important subject, and please be with us again next week at the same time when we will discuss an important issue. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Telemedia Services on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.